Hey, my name is Mike Acosta from ADSR Sounds.
And I'm Jim Stout.
And in this edition of Gear Chat, we're going to be discussing the Roland D-50. So last time, we talked about the DX7, and so today we're going to be going over the D-50, what made it popular, some of the things that we liked about it, maybe any controversy that was around it when it came out. Jim, we'll start off with you since you're the mad, triumphant synth guy here. So
oh,
your first experience with the D-50.
That's the pot calling the kettle black, if I say. Jesus. You are equally synthy. For me, the D-50 holds a very special place in my heart, mainly because when I was 14 years old, 13 or 14 years old, I wanted a D-50 more than air. You don't understand. It was just like where was the? I'll show you this. So this is a keyboard magazine. This is September 1987. And if we look in here, when they first launched it, I would pin this up like girls on the freaking wall. You know, I had synthesizers instead of girls in bikinis. I know, read whatever you want into that, but the basically there was an ad. There was a 4-page spread that came in this keyboard magazine. And it said a new technology is creating a powerful, storm in the world of sound synthesis. And it was 4 pages of just D-50 bliss. And when I was 14, I actually just used to put it like that. I was like, this thing, from the joystick, like what does that do? What is chase? What is all these other weird little things? And I was totally obsessed with it. And then I finally got a chance to play one at a music store, and I just it blew my mind. I'd never heard anything like this in person. I had heard the DX7 and a few other things, but I just thought it was the coolest synth ever. And it really started with this sound. So, and you hear all that kind of going on. Oh, yeah. And as amazing as the DX7 is, it is, but you never heard anything like that come from the DX7.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing synthesizer, but this is just different, in a different way.
Yeah.
And you got to understand, in the 80s, people weren't used to hearing this kind of digital crispness and all these kind of bells and whistles stuff happening. But it was just...
And it's still, it still has its own unique kind of sound. When you play it, it still doesn't really sound like anything else out there. It has its own, kind of unique niche, kind of sound. Like for me, again, you started with synthesizers a lot earlier than I did. So for me, again, I came on late, to catching on with some of these great, synthesizers.
What was it, 94?
Yeah, about then, about mid-90s, But again, I didn't get into really understanding.
The D-50 had already been, 8 years ago.
Yeah. But again, I didn't really get into like the whole deep synthesis and understanding like how things work and how to program stuff till late 90s, because I was just a preset kind of guy. So for me, like with the D-50, anytime when I hear about it or I hear the word D-50, I immediately I just feel like this massive, lush, like in-depth kind of sound with the reverbs and all that stuff. It was just very crystally, sparkly, and I automatically associate it, again, just me personally, with that whole like early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, like New Jack Sound era. Mm-hmm. Guys like Teddy Riley, groups like, Guy, Levert, then you had that whole Motown Philly kind of sound. And then you start hearing like artists like Janet Jackson, Whitney Houston, SWV, and of course, New Edition, mm-hmm. Can You Stand the Rain?
So
and that's that's where like I heard all these different sounds and the D-50, and it's just like all over that stuff, as well as being used on a bunch of other, tracks in different genres. But for me personally, like I automatically associate with that whole New Jack Sound era and stuff mm-hmm. like that, because it was just really, really cool. Everything from R&B to the more like upbeat kind of stuff, and it just really cut through the mix. But it did it in a way where like vocals were still there, mm-hmm. but it still added like this depth you know, because of the effects engine and the way everything sounded was just so in depth, you know, and I love it.
It was, and granted that it, you know, again, this is a fully digital instrument. It still has a signature tone to it.
Yeah,
it's one of those things that anybody who really knows the D-50 or has owned one, played it, and you hear a song, you can immediately recognize it. There's a certain timbre about it that's like, wow, I know that's a D-50. You can't say that about today's instruments. You know, it could be, it could have been a motif, a montage, a phantom, an oasis. It could have been. They all, in my opinion, sound the same.
Yeah,
you know?
and it's hard to differentiate. Some of them you can, because I know that there's hardcore guys out there that'll say, "Oh, my motif." Yes.
Write in the comments and we'll talk about it.
Yeah, we'll talk about it.
But I can promise you that if you had a D-50 in a track, you can hear it.
Yeah.
End of story.
Definitely.
And there were a lot of things. You know, you talk about the hip hop, New Jack City, all that kind of vibe that we're using the D-50. Again, a lot of them were using DX7 stuff as well. But in the D-50 world, it even branched out further into like the new age guys. So you had guys like Jean-Michel Jarre. Revolutions was done with pretty much the entire D-50, and there's a big misconception with that album. A lot of people think it was done with the Korg Wave Station because it's got some like wave sequencing stuff in there. That's not the Wave Station, it's the D-50. And the other one, things like Enya, Orinoco Flow. That was in there, straight up preset. And we'll talk a little bit more of the presets in here as well. That was used in there. The first sound that you heard is called Digital Native Dance, was intros to things like Dirty Diana, intros to a lot of crazy songs, lots of...
What about, I think, Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation?
Oh, yeah. It's all over it. And same with like Depeche Mode and Violator. If you listen to Enjoy the Silence and the big chorus parts, it is actually the Digital Native Dance sound. Without all the loopy stuff in there. So they took out the loop stuff, but you can hear it in there. It's straight up from there. So, yeah, another one like Paula Abdul. All of the Paula Abdul stuff, you know. Rick Astley, you know. Even though it's
never going to give you up.
Well, and a lot of those bass lines were DX7.
Yeah.
And that's what's famous. But a lot of the other melody stuff from there was all here. So I think, you know, when you look at this instrument, and we talked last time about how the DX7 had all these parameters and it put all the algorithms on the front. The D-50 did the same thing, but they call them structures. Now, the structures work a little bit different. Well, they work the same, they just have different features. So if we look at the structures on here, there were 7 of them, as opposed to the 32 algorithms of DX7. But you've got a little bit more control because you can actually have sample-based waveforms in here. And you have, so in structure 1, you see S and S. That is both, 2 of the partials in here are both synthesized. Then you have P and S. I'm sorry. What is it?
Yeah, it's PS.
Yeah, so that's partial, and that's going to be a sample-based waveform. So you could arrange them in kind of different ways, and the structure in here, you had partials, which were, it took 2 partials to make a tone, and then there were 2 tones to make a patch. So they had this whole thing, linear synthesis, like, okay, marketing buzz.
Yeah. And it's kind of cool too, because like when you look at the layout here, and we'll show you a close up on this, but this is also too, like if you've never seen a D-50 or worked with one, and then you've seen like, you know, the Roland v-synth, and then on top of the v-synth, you saw how you had those different structures, and you were able to choose the different structures and how the sounds were routed through different effects modules and whatnot. on the D-50 here, that's pretty much where that came from, is having these different structures. Only on the v-synth it was digital, and you can easily call them up right there a lot easier, and then add in your own samples and stuff. So
yes, this is very much the great-great-grandfather of the D-50, more so than just in the keyboard aspect, but in its idea and on how to manipulate samples, combining it with
You mean the great-grandfather of the v-synth?
Yes, sorry.
I was like, what?
I'm dyslexic. Give me a break. But the thing about this, the other thing about this was, it was one of the first instruments to ever use preset samples in here, and they weren't full samples. They were things like harmonics and the beginning breaths of, like, you know, flutes and trumpets and these kind of things. It wasn't until they had the loops and stuff in there, like the weird things, what we'll talk about in a minute. But that was their idea, was that they could. It was so hard to synthesize those little transients that they would just take these little snippets and then try to synthesize the rest. And the synthesizer in here is actually a digital synthesizer. So in the D-50, it can actually be considered the first virtual analog synthesizer. Everything in here was digital, and they were combining PCM sounds with what they called analog waveforms at the time, but they weren't analog, they were actually being digitally generated. So this beats the Nord lead out by about a decade, close to it, but this one actually did that, and it can create some, you know, pretty convincing analog sounds. And now, granted, it's not, you know, it's not a Jupiter 8, but a Jupiter 8 is no D-50, so they're different instruments. But you can, the width of sounds that this thing could create and emulate was huge. And I think, you know, let's touch a little bit about the presets in here. In the last video, we discussed of a lot of the presets that were used in the DX7 were famous sounds, and our hypothesis of why that was. Number one, we felt like that it just, nobody really programmed the sounds. So they, you know, they used what they had. In our opinion, or my opinion at least, the D-50 is different in that way. Granted, it's still not very easy to program. It's not like grabbing some sliders and making some cool stuff, but the presets in here were so good that everybody used them straight out of the box.
Oh yeah, and I think it touches again on how, you know, when you were saying a lot of the earlier synthesizers, again, if they had effects, it was maybe one, it was like a chorus or something like that. But, you know, for this to have the reverb on it along with everything else, and I think when you sat down and you played it, it just gave you that really in-depth, very lush kind of sound, and it sounded like record ready. Like you didn't really need to do a whole lot to it. It's like it was, you could literally hear it, you know, in a song. Like if you were there, you know, kind of like if you were a session player.
Yeah, it's that inspiration factor.
It was just there, you know, and it just, you would just start playing. You're like, track it, you know, let's go.
Even when you did take it into the studio, the first thing the engineer would do is say, take off all those effects on the keyboard. You know, it happened every time. Hey, took off all those shitty effects. I was like, God, man, but that makes, you know, it gets to the point where the effects start making the sound, and sometimes you can't really recreate that in the studio.
No.
It's part of it. But I remember, oh God, engineers would take those effects off, and they would just get all kind of bent out of shape about stuff. I'm like, just let it ride. It sounds good in the mix as it is. Just stop it. But yeah, this was the first, as far as I know, this was the first synthesizer to have reverb, chorus, and delay all inside of it. There were a lot of synthesizers that would have like an analog delay in them or some sort of chorus, but none of them had a digital reverb in them. And that immediately gave you that sense of space and that kind of polished sound, just like you said, you know, that kind of record ready. It sounds like you're playing a record. Let me get back to my card here. You know, I mean, nylon atmospheres. Let's get some of the strings. And you can see this has like a rosin bow. So in the joystick, you could actually mix between the partials and the layers. Hear that top end come in?
Oh, yeah.
So it's very much vector.
could hear like that breath, like just the initial transient on that.
Added it in, and yeah, it just.
I've always liked the calypso sound in here, the calypso patch, which was like a personal favorite of mine.
The bass marimba, synthetic guitar, Ritter. Oh, Jet Strings. Jet Strings was famous for George Michael, father figure. Father figure's all over this thing like a rash. It's the one of the charms about it is the aliasing that's going on in here. You know, you hear that? These are actually 8-bit waveforms, and I don't know what the sample rate is, but there's only one sample. There's no multi-samples in here. There's none of that. They took one sound and freaking spread it across. You know, very much like the Prophet VS, and. Let's see if we can find the spacious sweep. Again, that analog VA came into play. You know, digital filters, these kind of things. Digital filters with resonance. That was a huge, huge deal. Glass voices. These. Remember that one? That was a classic. Staccato Heaven, JX horns and strings. Very analogish. The choirs were never really that convincing. Nightmare. This was great. Digital cello, OK Corral, classic. Just crazy, crazy sounds. But and again, you know, getting back to why people were using this is the preset sounded so incredible. There was nothing else like that, like this when it dropped in '87 that sounded like this. Nowhere. And the guy behind these sounds, a guy by the name of Eric Pearsing. And
for those of you that don't know, Eric Pearsing is the founder of Spectrosonics. So he is the guy behind Omnisphere, Stylus RMX, Trillion, and even Atmosphere. Remember when that came out? So really, really cool stuff. Brilliant sound designer.
And you just Google him, and his rap sheet is amazing. And I always attribute Eric to, you know, like Ben Burt is to Star Wars. You know, because the guy who designed the sounds for the lightsaber and R2-D2, Eric Pearsing is, you know, to modern synthesizer sound design. Eric Pearsing really, really, you know, kind of changed the way people think about synthesizers. And as far as, you know, the DX7 gave you a buttload of presets in, you know, relative terms in 1980, but when the D-50 came in, you had 64 patches, and then you could have another 64 on the card. And so you had 128 sounds, and you were like, "Oh my God, that's insane." But everybody just loved the patches, and they didn't program it because it was so damn good. They were like, I don't need to program anything. It's got everything I need and stuff that I didn't even think that I needed.
So, and a lot of you may know and may not know, obviously Jim and I worked at Roland for a very, very long time. So there's actually like a myth, you know, about some stories behind the D-50 and Mr. Eric Pearsing and, you know, Mr. PCM, who was one of the Roland engineers in Japan that I was actually privileged to meet one day. It was from Scott Tibbs, and we were in Japan, and at the time it was when the Juno G was being developed, and I was there working on the development of the MC808, and Scott Tibbs had taken me into the lab, and he literally introduced the engineer to me as Mr. PCM, and he responds to that name, and I don't remember his name. Really, really, really super cool guy, but he goes by the name Mr. PCM, and they were kind of giving me the story and the background on it a bit. But I know that you've got the more in-depth story about the D-50 and Mr. Eric Persing.
Well, I mean, again, this is as the legend goes, and if you
supposedly,
but if you ever have to choose between truth and the legend, always choose the legend. But I don't know. But this is what I was told, that Eric was talking to Mr. PCM, because this has PCM-based samples in it, and apparently Mr. PCM was just messing around with stuff, and he was cycling all these different loops that they had in there that they were thinking about putting in here. Eric heard it and said, "Oh, that's great. I can use it for this, this, and that." And he's like, "Oh, this stuff isn't going in the D-50." And he's like, "This stuff absolutely has to go in the D-50." And it
almost didn't make it in.
Almost. And then, you know, to get back to the digital native dance, when you hear the sound, all the little, you know, things like that that go on in the background, all the kind of waves that are looping around, that wouldn't have made it in there unless Eric was like, "No, put that in there."
Thank you, Eric.
So Eric, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was a story that I understand. So another fascinating aspect for me of the D-50 was when I was working at Roland, the v-synth was my baby. That was my product, and I did all kinds of, you know, did a lot of sound design for it, and I was championing that product like you did for the MV.
Yeah.
The v-synth was my boy, and so I introduced the VC1 card, which was the PCMCIA card that you can plug into the back of a v-synth, and that turned it into a D-50. Again, legend has it that they actually had to go back and get the old source code off the 5.5-inch floppy disk and then try and re-port it to the v-synth operating system, and they did an amazing job with it. They ported all the samples and everything else, but it is a D-50 from all intents and purposes of a software world. From the analog stage world, it's different, and it sounds a little bit different, but whatever. It's not, that's not the big deal. The thing that I was most fascinated about was the engineers had emailed me the prototype of the D-50 for the VC card, and all I had to do was just put it on a PC card and plug it into the v-synth. It was good to go. I looked at the file. It was 997K for the D-50.
Wow. So less than 1 megabyte.
Less than 1 megabyte. This thing creates all these amazing sounds.
That's
now think about that for a minute. Think about that. All the classic, countless records that this thing has been on, less than a megagram.
Yeah, and especially when you're coming from like the synths that you have available to you now, like when you're, you know, dealing with patches like Inspector Sonic's Omnisphere 2, or even like Serum, where you're using custom wavetables and things like that. I mean, these patches nowadays are like, can be anywhere from a few megabytes for one patch.
Easy.
You know, up to 2 to 3, 4 gigs, like in a big, massive contact, you know, string patch or something like that, you know.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, and it's so much so where they're streaming it, you know. It's not even loaded into RAM.
Direct from disk.
Yeah, so that's how big that has gotten. But again, none of the only samples in here that have any kind of length are the looped ones. Right. Everything else are just transients and attacks of real instruments, and there's only 100 of them in here. You know, that blows my mind as well, and I think that, you know, definitely helps give it that distinctive sound.
Yeah.
You know, you can always hear it, you know, from the bell textures to all that stuff. I mean, you know, you immediately hear it. God, yeah, it's just there's so many cool things about this synth, and when it first dropped, and people's reactions to it, and guys in LA were getting work just because they had a D-50.
What was the price? Now, what was the price when this actually came out?
It was either $1895 or $1995. So when it came out, it pretty much put a, you know, death nail in the, you know, the final death nail for the DX7 when it came out, and the DX7 II came out at the same time as the D-50, but you put them side by side, and it was like
different.
It was like, whoa! People were used to hearing the DX7 sounds, and they were a little brighter, maybe, and you could layer two of them together, which gave it, you know, some more stuff. But just the tonal arsenal at the time for the DX7 wasn't as great, and people were already used to hearing it. This sounded fresh and new.
Yeah.
And you know, the mentality in the 80s was like, if it came out yesterday, it's old technology, I don't want it. What's coming out tomorrow? And people really had a real lack of appreciation, in my opinion, for, you know, the instruments and things like that. They just wanted whatever was going to be new. That's another video when we're talking about the 12-bit and 16-bit samplers. But I think, you know, it was Roland sold maybe like 1 billion of these or something. I don't know. I don't know the exact number because they would never tell me.
It's a lot.
It was a lot, and there are a lot of them around. But and I still see them kicking, you know, all over the place.
And it's got some weight to it too. Like you would think when you, at first glance, if you've never picked one up or anything like that, like, oh, okay, you know, it doesn't seem. But when you actually pick it up, you know, like this back metal piece here and everything, it's got some weight on it. You know?
Again, it gets back to when they actually built synthesizers, you know. You know, I'm saying they don't build them today, but I mean, these things they just don't have the same weight. It could because obviously, you know, I'm not going to get into the minutia of all that. Yes, components are smaller, they're lighter. Yes, I get all that, but it's different when you pick it up. It feels real, you know. And motifs are heavy for the wrong reasons, but but I think the you know, the general consensus, it was just amazing. And the display was huge. It was like, you know, 3 times bigger than a DX7 display. To be able to do this, and there's something that people don't really talk about is the joystick on here. I mean, this was used for data entry and, you know, blending between tones. People just, they don't think about it. They think of things like, you know, the K1, the Prophet VS, the TG33s, SY22s and 35s, all those kind of things that were more on the vector tip, and those came out, well, minus not counting the Prophet VS, but I think in '90 was when the Wave Station, the Prophet VS, and those kind of things happened. But the Wave Station was part of DSI anyway. Not DSI, but yeah. Fucking total nerd alert on that one. But so there were a lot of different offshoots of the D-50 synthesizer. A little bit later, they came out with the D-550, which is actually right behind you. That was the rack mount D-50. It was everything that this is, just, you know, in that box. And then they also came out with the D10,
D20,
the D20, which was the same thing as the D10, but had a sequencer on it and a 3.5-inch floppy drive on it, so you could store sequences. Then there was the D5 that came out, which was like a real entry-level kind of synth, real way cut down. And then they also did modules of those in the U110 module and stuff like that.
I remember that.
And then they also had the MT32. All of those were based off the, you know, linear synthesizer branding hype, but they were just digital synthesizers. So that was that kind of era in there. And then later they tried to follow up with the D50 with the D70, which has nothing to do with the architecture of the way the D50 works. The D70, they just went full-blown sample playback.
That doesn't sound like no way.
I swear.
Again, you know, because we worked there for so long, and you know,
we know how it works.
Yeah, you would see one product, and then, you know, the successor to the product, you would think, you know, oh, it's gonna play on what the original one did, but only better. And a lot of times the engineers would go in a complete different direction. You know. Well,
that was always the argument. I mean, you know, bless your heart, you had to go to freaking Japan and work on the Juno D, was it?
I went there for the Juno G at the time, and the MC808.
So the Juno G has everything to do with the original Juno 106, 60, all those. There's a complete direct comparison. Wow. So here's how they. It was the Juno series in America or in the world today does not mean what the Japanese engineers thought it meant. To them, the Juno were the more entry-level synthesizers. So you had the Junos and the Jupiters. The Jupiters were the big ones, the Junos were the smaller ones. They wanted to keep with that naming, but the perception over the last 30 years, that naming and what that means has changed. So when they introduced that whole Juno line, they just tried to get some name association with it, but they have nothing to do with those synthesizers and why people love them. Classic story, and we'll go into all that, you know, the lineage of those things later.
That'll be through multiple episodes.
Yeah.
We'll always touch base on these kind of things.
You know, again, you know, no, I'm totally going to harp on the Jupiter 80. Totally going to harp on it. Same thing. When that thing launched, their perception and what they wanted is not the same thing. But I digress. So when the D-50 came out in '87, it burned so bright and so hot, it burned out quick. And one of the main reasons that it burned out is going to be the topic of our next episode of Gear Chat.
Yeah.
That is going to be a massive shift in the way people think about synthesizers, the way people bought synthesizers, and what they used with them. And I want to point out again one more thing. When we talked about the ancient hieroglyphic alien writing that was all over the D-50 and the DX7, everything like that,
Gone.
there's a reason.
Yeah.
There's a reason. And we'll change the way synthesizers go on to be manufactured and what's actually important to people. But the D-50 is, in my opinion, one of the greatest digital synthesizers of all time. Again, I'm not going to get into a digital analog debate. It's not the point.
Yeah.
The point is that this thing had a shift on pop culture. It had a shift on pop music. You know, it forced people to go in different directions of stuff and allowed them to create things that they were never able to do before. The closest thing that was going to come to this is actually a synclavier. As far as like combining samples and synthesized waveforms and these kind of things, nothing else did it.
Yeah, and they were able to bring this to the masses at a more affordable price. I mean, obviously it's, you know, they're two different beasts, but essentially this is what you could do with this. But, you know, again, the price differences between the two it's a huge gap.
A synclavier is a $100,000 machine. This is $2,000.
Yeah. You want a house or, you know, you want to...
Yeah, I tell you what, you can't live in a synclavier. But I think, you know, again, it was just one of the amazing instruments in history in the 80s, and it is in the digital realm of stuff, but nobody cared. You know, it sounded good, and they could play with stuff, and I've wanted one ever since they first came out, and I didn't get one until about 2001, 2002.
So here you go.
I've had it since then, and but it was one of those kind of things like the music that I was producing at the time. The D-50 really didn't lend itself that well to what I was doing. We were doing a lot of like techno and acid and stuff like that, and it was all, you know, 303s and 203s that I bought for nothing back in the early 90s. And the D-50 really didn't fit into that. The ironic thing is the K1 was more popular with techno kids than the D-50 was, just because the K1 was so cheap.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole other story too.
But the D-50 was definitely at that time from '87 to you know, I'd probably say '91. You know, it was used on a buttload of records, and it's starting to get that resurgence again.
Yeah,
you know, you're hearing it, and even guys. You can hear the D-50 in a lot of samples from other manufacturers as well.
And another thing too, you know, that I don't know if we touched on this or not, but with the VC1 card, that was also available on a very cool module that Roland released that never really took off. It was called the Varios. You remember that? And I got to work on that a little bit. You know,
the Varios is an amazing little box. I mean, it was highly underpowered. You only had, like, I think 50 meg of RAM, and it was the exact same engine as the v-synth. Same chipset. And just real quick, the Jupiter and the 303 virtual stuff they released for the Varios, it's all v-synth VA. They just poured it in there, put a skin on it, and called it a TB303. It's not. All that stuff's in the v-synth. I have the patches.
But essentially, you could get a D-50. Like, if you find a Varios at a pawn shop or somewhere, they go really, really cheap. But if you can get that VC1 card, put it in that Varios, you've got yourself a D-50.
Yeah, the card will cost you more than the freaking Varios, though. You know, and sometimes you can find the Varios bundled with it, and also the Varios also ran the Vocal Designer card.
That was actually pretty cool. I used that on some remixes.
So that, again, another thing we digress. And I think that's really a testament. We've kind of gone off into a couple of different areas, but I think I think in a weird kind of way that helps demonstrate the power and the influence that this synthesizer.
Yeah, essentially
had.
like this being, you know, the great grandfather, and then all these different things that spawned off, you know, from the structure, the sound, the effects, and everything that this did, you know, and how it spawned off into other products that led to other things.
So I don't really know. I mean, we could probably go on for days about, you know, every little aspect of this and a lot of the other science and the synthesis and crazy stories that go on to it. But I think we touched on a lot of, you know, interesting aspects of this.
Yeah, and again, you know, when we do these gear chats, we're talking about specific instruments. You know, we're not talking about analog versus digital. We're not talking about which is better and why all the. We're just talking about the actual instrument itself,
and why it was important.
Yeah, why it was important, why it was cool, why we liked it. If we didn't like it, why, you know, and that's pretty much that. So
yeah, so that's it pretty much for this episode of Gear Chat. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Jim Stout.
And I'm Mike Acosta. And again, make sure to subscribe to the ADSR YouTube channel so that way you can stay up to date when we have new Gear Chat episodes, along with all the other product videos, everything from first look videos, walkthroughs that we do. There's a ton of really great stuff from a lot of the instructors that we have on ADSR. So again, make sure to subscribe to the ADSR channel so that you're always up to date with everything that we have coming out.
Also, let us know in the comments if there's any particular gear you would like to see. And we've got quite a selection already that we want to do. But there might be something that we're overlooking that has a real positive impact on pop culture and the music scene in general.
Yeah, it doesn't have to and it doesn't have to necessarily be a classic or vintage synth. We obviously are going to get around to some of the more modern instruments of today. We have a lot of stuff in here to obviously talk about, and tons of gear that we can kind of go back and forth about. But I think also too, if you guys would like to see maybe something with even software. I know it's Gear Chat, but it's software synthesizer is still gear. I mean, you're still using it for music production, so that may be something else that we'll consider looking into and possibly adding in. So again, make sure to comment below and see if what kind of responses we get, and maybe we'll add something in like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, from ADSR, thank you guys so much.
See you in the next video.